one verse today. I'm going to try and take that verse and kind of unpack it little by little. You know, when Jesus was around, he used a lot of illustrations. He looked at a tree and he would talk about how the fruit, you see the fruit, but then there's times there's no fruit. And he would talk about a sower, a man who went out and threw seeds on the ground. He used a lot of illustrations. And as I was looking at this verse, I was thinking to myself, how can I take this verse and unpack it with an illustration that we could say, I know what that means, so I know what this verse means. Put them two together. So let me read this for you. It says, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns, spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your hearts to the Lord. I'm going to focus on just the first part of the verse. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly. How? Here's the question I want to answer. How do we let this word dwell in us? Because that's what he's saying. Let the word dwell in you. Now, let me tell you what happened to us one time. When we had, I think it was back when we had only 5 kids, we were invited to a house to visit these people. And so my wife and I packed up all the little kids and we jumped in the van and away we went to their house. We get to their house, we knock on the door. They came to the door and they said, welcome, come on in. So we're walking in and the kids are in, and one of my kids, I don't remember which one, took a left-hand turn into the living room. As we're walking in the front door, he just bolted right on in. And the owner of the house said, stop, don't go in that room. And so I grabbed my kid, brought him back. You see, they had white carpeting in that room. That was their living room, white carpeting.
Oh, boy.
And the owner says, we don't use that room, only for special guests. Well, okay, so what did we do? We went into the dining room and we sat down. That was quite an experience. So going to a home, I really didn't feel comfortable in that home. Now, these were nice people, but I didn't feel comfortable. Why? Because their home was not an inviting, warm place to come to. It was more like a museum. See, this fellow was a doctor, and so he had put white carpeting and white sofas in his living room. Now, I think he should have had his head examined, right? Who puts white carpeting and white sofas in their living room? Well, somebody who has the money to do it and doesn't have little kids, I guess. So here's the point. We went to the home, but we didn't feel at home there. You hear what I'm saying? We didn't quite fit. Here's my question I'm asking. How do we let this word dwell, feel at home in us? In other words, he's saying, let the word feel at home in your hearts. How do we do that? How do we let God's word dwell in us, feel at home, feel comfortable in our home, our hearts, let's say? Here's the illustration I thought. Okay, follow with me. Here's 2 trees, right? The one on the right is a tree that's growing and has leaves. It's the same tree on the left in the wintertime. Exact same tree. In fact, right outside this door, I think that's an elm tree. These are 2 elms, I believe. You look out there and you go, they look like they're dead. Why do they look like they're dead? Because they don't have leaves on them, right? Think with me here. What happens in the dark of winter? In the dark of winter, the tree looks like that, right? Doesn't look like this. It's lost its leaves. It might even look dead. But you know what? There's a lot happening in a tree below the surface. Did you know that? I was talking to Ed the other day, and we were talking about this. He's got fruit trees. We even have these trees out here around the property. Did you know that in the dead of winter, even though on the surface it doesn't look like much is happening, there's a lot happening below the surface. let me tell you this. You can look this up in your encyclopedia, but I thought it was interesting. God's wisdom on display. When you look at that tree out there, you look at any tree in the winter, I want you to remember God's wisdom is on display. How? Well, and I'm not a scientist, but I can read. There's an acid called abscisic acid. You kids look it up in your dictionary, you'll see this. That when the light begins to diminish, when the days are shorter, when the temperature is colder, a tree begins to produce an acid. This is God's wisdom on display. And you know what that acid does? It stops the division of the cells. In a tree, it's called mitosis. Here's a cell. It pinches in the middle and it forms two. And then each of those grow, pinch in the middle, and form two. It's called cell division. That's how a tree grows, by cell division. But when the temperature drops and the days get shorter, the tree produces abscisic acid that stops the division. And so all winter long, no division going on. That's why there's no leaves. That's why the tree isn't growing, because everything stops. Also, what the abscisic acid does is it forms a barrier between the end of the branch and the leaf. And that's why the leaf ends up dying and falling off. God's wisdom on display. Who could have thought of this? Did this all happen by chance? Billions of years of trial and error, and finally this happened? No. God is the master designer. The scientists can tell you that this happens, but they can't explain how it happens. The tree just knows how to produce this acid. How does it know? Oh, we have a great God. Okay, so I don't want to teach you a science class today, but a tree needs what's called dormancy. You know why? Because when those trees are standing there with no leaves, there's a lot going on below the surface. Now, it is possible to trick a tree. You can take a tree and put it in a greenhouse, right? Where you control the light and you control the temperature. But you know what the scientists have found out? That when you take a tree, a deciduous tree, one with leaves, and you put it in a greenhouse and you control the light and you make it just keep growing and it never senses a short day or cold, so it doesn't produce the acid and it doesn't have its time of dormancy. You know what? It grows and grows, but you know what they found? It cuts the life of the tree down to a third. The tree will die in a third of the time that it would normally live out in the open. So you can trick it, but it's disastrous for the tree. The tree needs that dormancy time. Why? What's going on below the surface? The acid that's produced that stops it from growing and makes the leaves fall off doesn't affect the roots. Did you know that? That during the time of dormancy, like right now, the roots are growing. They are dividing like crazy. And they've already stored all of the nutrients. They're down there working real hard, growing, looking for water and looking for minerals. So below the surface, the underground system of roots is busy at work. So even though that tree out that front door looks like it's dead, looks like nothing is happening below the surface, those roots are growing. Now, hopefully they're not getting into our sewer system and blocking our sewer, but they're looking for water and looking for minerals. Roots are growing. Roots are searching for water and minerals. And the roots are storing water and minerals where they're safe. I come from an area of the country where in the wintertime it gets really cold. And the sap in the wintertime, the acid, causes the sap to retreat down into the roots. In the summer, the sap is going up. In the winter, it comes out. That's why we have back our way, we have maple syrup. They're able to jam a hole in the trunk of a tree and sap comes out. Maple syrup. Why? Because it's coming down. All right. So where's that all going? It's going down in the roots where it's safe for the winter. The roots are not going to freeze. Back our way, I remember I have a brother-in-law that lives in upstate New York, and he said it got so cold one winter that the apple trees, where the roots are all full of the nutrients and all the sap comes down, the apple trees exploded. It got so cold that the little bit of moisture that was left in the trunk just exploded. That's how cold it got. But normally that doesn't happen because the sap can get down quick enough. But this was an early freeze. So here's the point. Below the surface, there's a lot going on. Even though up above it doesn't seem like much. What's the lesson from the tree? Again, we're not here just to study science. I want you to see this, the tree illustration, and we're going to apply it to this verse. What's the lesson from the tree? When things look dark, we need our time for strengthening our private lives. Just like a tree needs that time when things are harsh up on the surface, it needs that time below the surface to strengthen and grow its roots. Focus times for growing our roots. It's part of the rhythm of life. As you look at a tree, I want you to remember this. That tree goes through this rhythm every year. Could it be that we could learn something from a tree? Could it be that God allows times of harshness, winter, for us to grow our roots? Retreat, spend time with God, be nourished, and begin to grow. Even though on the surface not much is happening, we can take that time, just like a tree, to grow our roots. Now, I thought about this. Okay, Paul, you're talking about a tree, and you're showing us how trees take that time when everything on the surface is harsh and hard. They're taking that time to grow their roots. But can you find this in the Bible? Does this happen anywhere? Let me tell you what happened in 1 Samuel chapter 30. Okay? Just listen to this story. This is a story of David on the run. Remember David? He was anointed as the king of Israel, right? Only one problem. There was already a king, Saul, right? But God was rejecting Saul because Saul was going bad. He was committing terrible sins, and in the end he even went to a witch. He inquired of a witch. Bad, bad. And God says, Saul, I've taken the kingdom away from you and I've given it to another. So David was anointed, but the problem was Saul didn't like him. And so in 1 Samuel, we find David on the run. He's hiding like an animal among the rocks in the caves. He had a group of men with him who were called his valiant men, men who supported him and helped him, but they were out hiding in the rocks. And there was one time when Saul got pretty close, and he was hiding back in a cave, and Saul came into the cave. David back there with his men, and they're hiding like, oh no, they're going to catch us, but they never saw him. Amazing how God took care of David. Here's the point. David faced probably the lowest time of his life. When winter was as harsh as it could be, life was throwing stuff at him that was unbelievable. Let me tell you what happened in 1 Samuel 30. David's on the run. He and the men are hiding in the rocks. Where are the women and children? Because they were married and they had kids. The women and children hid. So here's what David did. He went to the southern part of Israel, and the women and children, they left in this little town called Ziklag, thinking Saul will never come down here to find us, and the women and children will be safe in this town. The men, David and the men, are hiding in the caves and the rocks up in the mountains. Everything's fine. Saul can't find him. Saul's looking all around for David, can't find him. The women are safe. David's up there in the mountains. Well, you can't stay in the mountains too long. You know that, right? When you go camping, you have to have supplies, right? So David and the men come down to the town of Ziklag for supplies, for food. You read 1 Samuel 30, as they approached a little hill overlooking the town of Ziklag, their hearts melted. hearts melted. You know what they saw? What had been the town of Ziklag in the little valley was nothing but a pile of ashes. The Amalekites, enemies of the Israelites, had come, burned the town to the ground, completely destroyed. The Bible says in 1 Samuel 30, their hearts melted. So here's David and his men coming back for supplies, checking in on their wives and their kids, and the town is burned to the ground. It says they wept until they could weep no more. Put yourself in David's position. He's at one of the lowest points of his life. Talk about winter, harshness, tough times. They had no idea what had happened. They just knew the town was completely burned to the ground. Here's what the Bible says in 1 Samuel 30, verse 6. David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him. Here's what happened. His men turned on him. Not only did he see Ziklag burned to the ground, his own men said, David, it's your fault. We lost our families. And they turned on him. They spoke of stoning him because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and daughters. And here's the important part of the verse. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. You know what's amazing here? We're not told exactly how this happened. But we know that at the lowest point, when David's about to be stoned by his own men, they're blaming him for losing their families. David does something. He goes off by himself with God. And we're not told exactly how he did it. I have some ideas. And I think there's a reason why we're not told exactly how he did it. Because you know what you and I like to do? We like to copycat. We say, well, if David did this and got these results, if I do the same, I'll get the same results. Have you ever thought about that? God doesn't give us prescriptions. He wants us to come to him as we are. How did David go to God? It doesn't say. I got some ideas. David's a songwriter. He wrote the Psalms. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, thou art with me. Is this a valley of the shadow of death? It sure is. Maybe David sang the songs that he had written. The Lord is my strength and my salvation. The Lord is my rock. Maybe he just rehearsed what he had written in Psalms. Maybe he just rehearsed what he knew about God. But we're not told exactly what he did. Here's what we're told. He strengthened himself in the Lord his God. You know what he did? He grew his roots. In the winter of his life, rather than fight against God, he just kept working below the surface. He spent time with his God. He strengthened his roots. He nourished himself. You see what's going on here? David, without even knowing it, followed the example of a tree. He strengthened himself. Now, I'm not going to spoil it for you guys, especially you kids. Read 1 Samuel 30. It's amazing because among his men was a guy named Abiathar. And he pulls Abiathar by the side. He says, Abiathar, come here. We got to go to God. We got to find out what to do. We got to find out what happened to our women, the women and children. What happened to this town? Because there were obviously people walking around who had escaped the town, and he asked them, what happened? What happened? Oh, the Amalekites came. What'd they do? They took all the women and children as slaves. They killed some of the men. So he calls Abiathar over and he goes, what do we do, Abiathar? Abiathar says, let's go to God. And in those days, the priests had this thing that they wore that had stones. And we don't know exactly, we don't know a lot about it, but we do know that it was a way that they inquired of the Lord. David goes, what should we do, God? Should we go after the Amalekites? And Abiathar's thing here apparently lit up, or the stones, whatever. We don't know exactly, but the word from the Lord was, go get them. David grabbed his men, and I'm not going to spoil it. You read it. It's fascinating. But here's the point. He didn't go after the Amalekites until he had spent time with God. You see the point? Sometimes when we're in the winter and the harshness of our life, rather than nourish our roots and grow our roots, you know what we do? I'm going to go and fix this. Hold on. What does a tree do? It doesn't send out leaves in the winter. It waits until it's fully nourished, until its roots have grown, and then it starts to grow again. That's the lesson from the tree. And that's exactly what David did. He strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And when God gave him the green light, he went ahead. All right, here's another one. Well, let me talk about this. Here's what we're not talking about. I just want to make sure you all understand this. When we talk about spending time with God and strengthening our roots, we're not bargaining with God. That's not a time when we sit down and say, okay, God, if I read my Bible every day for 10 minutes, then you'll do this, right? That's called bargaining with God. Can you do that? No. Is God going to do something because you did something? No. When we talk about strengthening like David did, spending time with God, and growing our roots, we're not talking about sitting down and going, hey, God, I got a deal. If I do this, will you do that? You know, I need a job. So, okay, God, if I read the Bible or if I help out at church, will you get me a job? No, that's not going to happen. Some of you know that my wife and I took care of an elderly lady who was a widow. She didn't have a family for a couple of years until she passed. She just passed last year, but in going through her things after she passed, a letter came, and I opened it up, and I was shocked. The letter, and I'm not going to give names because that's not important right now, but the letter was from a well-known TV evangelist. Apparently, she had watched a program, and the guy said, if you send me $100, I'll pray for you and your prayer will be answered. And so she sent him $100, and the letter came back saying, thank you for your donation. I prayed for you, and you can expect an answer that the Lord is going to heal you. Because that's what she had asked for. She had an illness. But she had already passed when the letter got there. And I read that and I thought, what a shame. That's bargaining with God. Can you imagine a guy going on television saying, if you give me $100, I'll pray for you, and God will do this for you?